This is Late Night Science with your hosts Axel Schumacher and Daryl Baker. Today's guest is an entrepreneur and mathematician from Boulder, Colorado. He studied number theory at Metropolitan State University and the University of Colorado. Co-founder of Ethereum. He's the CEO of Input Output Hong Kong and founder of Cardano, a public blockchain platform that hosts the ADA cryptocurrency. Our guest, Charles Hoskinson. So welcome. Today we have Charles Hoskinson on our podcast on Late Night Science. Welcome. How are you doing?
Axel, it's great to be on. Daryl, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Wow. Where are you now? Are you in Colorado? Or?
Warm, sunny Colorado. Always warm, always sunny. Sometimes Colorado.
Of course. I wouldn't expect anything different. So, for our audience who are, for those guys that are not familiar with you, can you give a very brief intro? So you are a mathematician and you are obviously the founder of Cardano and co-founder of Ethereum. So both are one of the main blockchain platforms in the world. So, but tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you into that field.
Well, a long time ago, I wanted to be a doctor. My dad's a doctor and my brother's a doctor. Grandfather was a doctor. Uncle's a doctor. And I was kind of the odd man out. I hated people and I was much better at math stuff. So I said, well, if I'm doing math stuff, I really have three good options. You could be a computer scientist, a physicist, or a mathematician. And I always found mathematics to be just a wonderful field because you could just be lost in your own head and think about a single problem for hours or days at a time. So I did that for a while and I was going to get a PhD in it. And then somewhere along the way, I kind of got lost in the bureaucracy of academia and a bit hopeless because I couldn't really find a place to be. I said, well, okay, you graduate, you go become a postdoc. You write a lot of papers on topics you don't care too much about, but they're sexy modern mathematics. And then there you eventually get a tenure track position. And after you get tenure, then, in your 40s, maybe you can be a real man and, go out and do interesting things like work on Goldbach conjecture or, something like that. And that was just so dreary. I was like, oh, okay, so I'm going to, not do what I want for a long time, be a political bureaucrat in the academic world. And then, my 40s, I finally may be rewarded with something, and then I'll be a big fish in a small pond. That's terrible. So then, right around that time, the cryptocurrency space had just begun. This was like 2011, 2012, and I knew about it, read some papers about it. And I said, all right, well, I'll buy some, I'll mine, I'll trade. And I did some odd jobs for people where they'd pay me Bitcoin and things like that. I used Bitmit a lot. Bought an Xbox for a lot of Bitcoin. And I think if I'd kept it, it'd be worth maybe more than $1 million at this point. Very expensive Xbox, this kind of stuff. But I just really loved the culture. I really loved the people back then. And it was cool because it was an intersection of all my passions. I like Austrian economics. I like thinking about monetary policy. I really enjoy cryptography and rigorous.
But you really jumped into the field at the right moment then. You were not too late like myself. So
well, I mean, it's like trains. If you miss one, another one comes. So if you've missed the infrastructure wars, now it's the DeFi land. And after DeFi, it'll be something else. It's just like internet, right? Oh, I didn't start Google, so there's never going to be another great internet startup. Then cell phone apps come around, and then there's a whole bunch of interesting things there. And then the next thing comes around, and there's a bunch of interesting things there. So I'm not so dreary to think that you miss something. It's just you have to wait a little while. And as long as you are curious and inquisitive and willing to take a risk and you're not afraid of failure, then eventually you'll find something that you really love and really enjoy. And It's especially interesting when whatever you're doing actually has real life utility to lots of
Yeah.
people. What's so cool about cryptocurrencies isn't that we have these tokens and they're worth lots of money and the markets go up and the markets go down. It's the fact that we actually can have a real conversation about identity and property and what should
Yeah.
finance look like in the 21st century? What should voting look like in the 21st century?
Mm.
All these things. And then you can apply it to any field like academic publishing. Maybe we can open that up and create different incentives and get rid of the journals and make everything open source. Maybe we can talk about a different way of doing credentials and change the university structure. Hey, maybe create different incentives for people to learn things or trade knowledge. Maybe we could redo the social networks so they
You are correct.
don't
But
radicalize.
I think most people are there not really aware of all the opportunities that are lying in the whole decentralized blockchain space, right? Everyone thinks, okay, everyone knows Bitcoin, but all the other options we have where we can go, where we can apply our science, where we can build ecosystems. This is, I think, to the normal person out there, largely unknown. Right.
Well, and that's the magic. In the next 25 years, we're going to be chasing down and finding out all those possibilities. Just like for over 25 years, we've been chasing down and finding out possibilities about the internet and what you can do with it and what types of businesses you can run on it and utility you can provide to society.
Yeah.
In some cases, it's very positive, and some cases very negative.
Yeah, I agree. I think we can, and we will see massive shifts in how businesses and organizations are run, and a lot will be changed by those technologies. No? But on the other hand, I see also a lot of resistance in many fields. Like you saw it first in finance, that of course the traditional banks, they were very opposed to new, all this crypto area. And I face the same with my company, with Chevron. Like we introduced blockchain like 2 years ago, and the adoption in the healthcare vertical is very slow. Like the pharma companies, they are just, oh, leave me alone with this Bitcoin scam thing. And so they're very reluctant to basically join the movement and make something out of it. No?
They're getting on board with supply chain and counterfeit drugs and things like that. And I think that's been their segue into that community or our community, I think. But there's still that disconnect between, how do we get those guys to onboard them?
Well, every problem has its time. And, one of the biggest issues we had last year was the distribution of PPE. And they said, oh God, how is it we live in the 21st century? We don't even know where the ventilators are, and we can't get masks to the right people and so forth. And so there's been enormous interest in the blockchain space for contact tracing, for PPE tracing. And that's a gateway drug. And once they're used to that, that's going to really push things along. The other thing is the globalization of medical records. So there's a lot of discussion, for example, with the IATA about vaccine passports. And so how do you track and trace people who've been vaccinated? And can we verify if vaccines provide sterilizing immunity or not? Oh, okay. Well, what does that mean? It means that you need, interoperability between these siloed systems, and nobody wants to give up their siloed system. So you need like a meta layer that's going to sit above those siloed systems. And then suddenly blockchain makes a lot of sense because no one's in charge and you don't have to give up sovereignty and so forth. And
this is exactly what we did at Chevron. So this to give the audience a little bit background. So we started this company around building a massive healthcare data marketplace that has also a blockchain layer underneath, so that people can anonymously share their data on a global level and offer it basically for scientific research to be analyzed, this data, and that they can be also incentivized for sharing their data. And
I mean, that's a powerful currency. That's how Israel got to a 27% vaccination rate, whereas America is just sitting at 3%. It's like, where did they get all the doses from? They made a deal with Pfizer to share their medical data because they have a unified EMR for the whole country. And they said, hey, how would you guys like data on 9 million people? Would that be something? It was almost like, remember Star Trek 4 with Scotty? When he was showing him transparent aluminum, and he's like, would this be something you're interested in? They're like, oh, you don't say. So, it's all about how you ask. It's all about the timing, and it's already become clear that Bitcoin's here to stay. Crypto's here to stay. Institutions and banking, it's like Bitcoin's old news now to us, but to them, it's like, oh, wow, we're modern now. We're all together on this stuff. And it'll
we come directly.
identity and supply.
Charles, then we come to the next point. So you mentioned already, so Bitcoin is a little bit the old stuff, and we see a lot of new use cases coming out where we can apply blockchain technology. So you started, I think, in 2015, Cardano, the Cardano blockchain ecosystem, right? Maybe tell us a little bit about it and what's the strengths in Cardano compared to the other old crypto currencies and blockchain platforms like Bitcoin or Ethereum.
Well, you guys can tell my hairline is receding, the belly is growing, the white hair is coming in. I've been in this space for a while. And so when we started Cardano, it was more of a first principles blank slate approach where we said, we've been doing crypto for a long time. If we're going to do it all over again, let's do things from basically bedrock and build our way up and treat it kind of like a DARPA program, high risk, high return, and then see if we can commercialize and build something useful. So what would a third generation cryptocurrency look like? So kind of the first generation was Bitcoin. And that was all about like, can you create decentralized money and the movement of value? Huzzah, they did it. But the problem is it's blind, deaf, and dumb. So it doesn't really do much outside of being able to move value around. And that alone is, I guess, worth $600-700 billion to people. Wow. But then Ethereum came along. And when I created that with Vitalik and the rest of the gang, it was all about programmability. It was kind of like when JavaScript came to the web browser. You said somehow we can go from static web pages to Facebook and YouTube and Amazon, dynamic pages that are very interactive. So similarly, you have now smart contracts, and so you have dApps and DeFi and all this really cool, interesting stuff. But the problem is that doesn't scale. You can't go from thousands and tens of thousands to millions to tens of millions and make that clean and keep all the guarantees that we'd like to have in terms of homogeneity and privacy and security and so forth. And so there's a lot of protocol deficits there. Second, there are over 8,000 blockchains, and there's thousands of legacy systems. And so imagine a world where Wi-Fi was like vendor dependent. So you could only connect to Apple routers or only connect to Samsung routers. It would be horrible. You'd never have Wi-Fi because every hotel you go in would probably have a different router than the one that you're used to. And it would be a very fragmented ecosystem. So it's a miracle that you can be in Iran, North Korea, and Canada. And despite the fact that they're all very radically different countries, they probably all follow the same Wi-Fi standard, and your phone can connect to the Wi-Fi router. Wow. Okay, so similarly, we need Wi-Fi-like moment. We need an interoperability moment where you can move value, information, people, and identity between the systems. And that's a real hard question. And then the last part, and it's the hardest, is sustainability. And what that basically boils down to is the who pays and who decides part of cryptocurrencies. So these are social systems. And ordinarily, when you have big platform, there's a platform manager, like Microsoft to Windows, Google to Android, Apple to iPhone, right? And so as a consequence, despite the fact they have billions of customers, there's a single vision on how that platform should evolve, or a guiding vision from at least one major leader amongst a coalition and a governance structure therein. Cryptocurrencies are saying, hey, we're bottomed up. So there's no leader, there's no king, there's no guiding company. Like Blockstream is not in charge, Vitalik is not in charge, I'm not in charge, these types of things. Instead, somehow, some way, despite the fact there's no leader, we're going to make really complicated decisions, like how do we deal with quantum computers and what they do to our space? Or, how do we scale to 1 billion users? Or, how do we go from replicated distributed systems, accepting that maybe we have to throw some data away, in which case whose data gets thrown away? Because if you save everything forever, you'll have like a petabyte sized blockchain and only Google or the NSA can possess it. You have to pick which one.
But I imagine it's such a complex system that you are describing here. It
Exactly.
needs really a lot of hardcore science to make this work, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly why we started from first principles. And so in 2015, we said, forget everything we know, begin with the beginner's mind, and let's just write papers and spend 2 years in pure academic research. Let's partner with a bunch of universities, and let's just fill in all the broken windows and potholes we find as we go, and try to figure out from first principles what's the best way of handling these 3 design goals: the scalability goal, the interoperability goal, and the sustainability goal. So we wrote, like, what is a blockchain? We wrote something called the GKL15 model, where we actually, for the first time ever, created a formal model of security for a blockchain. Yay. And then we were saying, well, what's the ideal consensus protocol? Is it proof of work? Is it something else? And so we created our own proof of stake protocol called Ouroboros. 92 papers later, peer reviewed at some of the top venues, 92 papers, like 10,000 plus citations. It's crazy what we've had to go through. We basically built out this corpus, this body of science that kind of explains how to build a cryptocurrency
Oh, I
in the
love that.
direction of those three
Mm.
goals. And we had to
Right.
do this with an army of scientists, from 4 different universities, University of Edinburgh, University of Athens, Tokyo Institute of Technology, and now University of Wyoming. So across the world, Japan, America, Europe, and then all these contributors from like Connecticut and Virginia and other places, and some people at Stanford and UIUC, and really top guys and gals.
That's why I love your project. That's why I really love Cardano. But it's the way how you approached it. It's basically the scientific method. I'm a
Yeah.
big believer in the scientific method.
But here's the problem, Axel, with science.
Yeah.
It's not product. You have to somehow convert this giant corpus of science, which lives in Platonic ideals and the philosophical realm, and turn it into real life stuff. I studied pure mathematics. None of the things we talked about really were particularly useful to society. Perfectoid groups and things like that. Okay, yeah, what exactly does that mean to your day to day? It's like it's not really doing much for you.
In the real world, if you see where blockchain is actually used or crypto is used. I mean, that's my input into this. Was really, I came in from a scientific background, clinical genomics, and but I've been doing work in the Middle East and Africa where I was noticing people were using their mobile phones to sort of crypto and buy drugs, buy medicine, buy a whole host of things. And I was like, in my home country of England, it was not being used at all, or I didn't see it as prevalent in those areas. And I was like, I need to take note of this, look into this further. And you meet somebody like Axel and yourself, and it's like, all these little ducks are in place.
Right. And so, you start from this abstraction, this perfectoid space type of a thing. And then you say, well, let's build a real life use case for that, right? So you have to actually build the blockchain. You have to actually deploy it. You have to actually make it work with 1 million people. So from 2017 on, that's really been the focus of the project. And we, of course, wanted to do it in a very academic way. So what we did is we said, oh, okay, let's build it in Haskell, which is this beautiful, purely functional programming language that has one foot in the industrial world, mostly in the financial industry, like banks like Barclays, and one step in the academic world, one foot there. And so it's kind of straddling both. And it was a great language to help us translate the science into real code that could run on Windows computers and Linux computers and Mac computers and actually turn into a real cryptocurrency. The problem was that there's not many of those developers floating around for that type of code. So we had to learn how to be not just a great science company, but we had to learn how to be a great engineering company. God, that was harder than I thought. I read the book.
I believe that. Now it's
like
we read that.
Yeah, it's
difficult.
Like saying,
yeah, of course.
You're going to learn how to have sex from a book. It's not going to happen. so we had to kind of like try it a little bit. We had to learn how to be great engineers, and boy, it took us a few years. But you know what? We did. We built a great engineering company, and we have wonderful CTO. We have agile processes. We had to make the Haskell language better. We're co-founder of the Haskell Foundation. We brought the whole community together. We built up a bunch of libraries. We actually worked on compilation JavaScript and WebAssembly. So there are a lot of engineering things that we had to do and infrastructure things we had to do. The long and the short is we brought it to market, and we're now today one of the most decentralized ecosystems around. We have over 1,200 stake pools, makes us about 100 times more decentralized than Bitcoin. We're a lot faster than Bitcoin. We have a lot of great infrastructure, and we've made real great progress in each of those categories, the scalability, interoperability. And
Charles, and then tell me, how is a project that is obviously so large and needs so much work before you can put out a product? How is this financed? How does it work?
Yeah, so in our industry, what we've generally done is invented this thing called the ICO. Ooh, very dirty. But basically, the idea is that you get a large amount of project finance, project capital, and then you deploy that capital over a long arc to go and do research and build things. As it's nothing new when you really think about it. We do it all the time with large-scale projects like DARPA, for example, had a program called Kalo. It was ran from 2003 to 2008. It's hundreds of millions of dollars they put into it. And basically, the long and short was they wanted to build an intelligent agent that can act as your secretary. Now, the people who created that program, they wrote hundreds of papers. They worked with more than 60 institutions. And the end result was the product we all know and love, Siri. They created Siri based on that. So that's an old funding model. And generally you see governments do that with mega projects, whether they're building a particle accelerator or they're doing vaccine research, or they're doing something that they say there's a large collective good that can be generated from this. It's high risk, high return. So there's a high risk of failure. But what we've basically done as an industry is found a way to finance projects like that in a somewhat similar way, but distinct in its own way. And if it creates a lot of good, you actually have a measuring stick of that. Like Ethereum, for example, we did a $18 million ICO. I think it produced now $130 billion worth of value in a huge ecosystem.
Wow.
So a pretty good ROI there. And similarly, Cardano was done in Japan, and that was about a $72 million project finance. And now it's resulted in an $11 billion ecosystem. And that ecosystem has almost 1 million people in it. And there's, I think, now 12 development companies, including mine, that actively write code and work there. And then there's commercialization companies, the stateful operators. So it's a very decentralized ecosystem. And what's cool is because of that, you have all these people, some like each other, some don't like each other, some work together, some don't, that are all working for collective good to advance this protocol. And our particular contribution above and beyond the science and the engineering is also we're trying to commercialize the technology in Africa, amongst other places. So we've had an office in Ethiopia for over 3 years. I've gone to Addis Ababa, and we're bidding on government projects involving millions of people to give them economic identity and to give them peer-to-peer lending and peer-to-peer insurance and stable coins and all kinds of cool things that have emerged out of our industry, and globalize them for the first time ever. Actually make them able to participate in global commerce the same way you and I can do. So that's just so cool to be able to start as a science project,
That's
become an
very
engineering
cool.
project, and then commercialize it in a way where we actually have something valid to say for the billions of people who are unbanked, and bring them something cool and interesting.
I mean, that's all what I think is in the end is blockchain about. Like, you can empower people all over the world to really participate in something that in the past was out of their reach, right?
Well, it's always amazing how a few cents can make such a big difference to a whole group of people. I mean, in our privileged way we live, it's not very much, but to certain individuals and certain families, a few dollars a day is an amazing amount of money, and it can do some radical changes in those areas. So,
right. And it's important to understand the demographics. 70% of Ethiopia is at or under the age of 30. And their economy pre-COVID was growing at 10 to 15% per year. And China has put about $1 trillion in direct foreign investment to the entire continent of Africa. And about 80% of the population of Africa will be internet enabled by 2025 to 2030, somewhere there. So they're all going online. When you throw your cell phone away, it ends up there. So that supercomputer in your pocket is going to be an African supercomputer in 18 to 24 months.
So do you expect a massive shift how the power in science and computing is really changing over the next years? Will we see a lot of new things coming from Africa, actually, if there are so many young people going into this? Yeah.
The great democratization of knowledge and the great democratization of opportunity is occurring. Because here's the reality. If you're a really bright kid in Senegal or Uganda or somewhere else, you can go to edX, you can go to Coursera, you can go to Udemy, you can go to YouTube, and you can just sit and watch lectures from Feynman. You can watch lectures from literally the top people in the entire field. And most of the textbooks are either free or BitTorrent free. So you can get access to knowledge, and no one's going to complain about you doing that. And then suddenly you are on a knowledge basis on equal footing with everyone else in the world. So then it's just infrastructure at that point. Do you have the same banking infrastructure? Do you have the same credit infrastructure, the same venture capital infrastructure, the same insurance infrastructure, and so forth to protect and levy that? And that's really what our industry is doing, is we're kind of creating an alternative view of how to run the world financial operating system that is incredibly low cost, and it has no kings. It has no middlemen. Basically, you are your own bank, and that means that bridge that gap has been bridged in a very elegant way. And the thing is, we don't have to rely on charity. We don't have to rely on people being nice and being generous. This is not a let's go save the world type of thing. It's self-interest. What else are you going to do if you're a 25-year-old kid in Senegal? You just want to live in poverty without clean drinking water? No. You have an internet connection. You have a computing device. You're going to go and learn and build and innovate and you're going to go work like hell to get out of that situation because you want to take care of your family. You want to take care of the people that are important to you. And if we give them better tools, they can use those tools to build whatever the heck they want and create enormous amounts of value. There's $5.4 trillion of illiquid wealth in Africa, 5.4
Wow.
trillion with a T, you know, and so that's a huge amount of value that's just locked
That's
up.
massive.
It's
Yeah,
inaccessible.
it's massive.
And if you put the right systems in, you can use those systems to liberate it and then spread it around. And then suddenly you've enriched this young population.
And I
just
think
like
I think
China.
they even have they have a massive opportunity there because they are not relying on so much on all these old structures in science and business, and they can start basically from scratch, what is much more difficult in the US or in Europe.
Right.
We see this in the healthcare ecosystems. If you want to change something in our modern, great precision medicine healthcare ecosystems, it's almost impossible. It takes ages. Whereas I think countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, they basically they have the opportunity to start from scratch. Similar like you started Cardano from scratch and said, okay, let's throw out everything what we knew before. Let's make it right from the start. And this is something which probably it wouldn't work in the US, right? You could not say, look, now you have a new president tomorrow. So he would not be able to say, look, let's throw out all our healthcare ecosystem
Yeah.
and let's start from scratch. We're
There you
doing it
go.
completely new.
Opa. No, you can't, but you can in the developing world. That's why it's so damn refreshing to work there, because you have all these incredibly young people like Ethiopia. They're led by a guy, I think in his 40s, who's a cryptographer. He's a computer scientist, is the prime minister of the country. He can actually read our papers, you know, so it's so refreshing to have a world leader who's not 80 and who actually understands how computing works and actually has done work in computing.
But but that means you need leaders that are also educated in science. Now I'm sitting here in Munich in the moment, and we have luckily also a head of state who is
she was a physicist.
So Merkel worked in quantum physics, so she has a good understanding of this stuff. But most politicians do not, and I think you had, especially in the last years, you had very concerning movements in the United States and also in other countries where science really lost ground, and it was really you had even some anti-science movements, I would say, right?
Well, politicians are politicians, aren't they? They're career politicians, so it's I don't think it's a natural state for a scientist to go into a political scenario, but it's changing. But
so it's important to understand that politicians are a simulacra of the people, and so in essence they're a reflection. And if we have shallowness that is rewarded, we kind of live in a vanity culture where everybody's running around in a Dunning-Kruger way, you get an orange goblin, you get Trump. If you have, you know, a deep respect for foresight and analysis and good decision making, then you end up with fundamentally different leadership. And there's no coincidence why we see Germany and Singapore, for example, having scientist leaders. You know, Germany, it's a physicist, and Singapore, it's a computer scientist. And both of them are very well-run countries. So if we want to fix our politicians, we have to fix our culture, and we have to fix the way that we talk to each other, and we have to fix the way we think. You know, anti-vaxxers are a great example of this. And so vaccines are like anything else. They're a medical tool. And there's a good, a bad, and an ugly with a medical tool. And they've been with us in the human race for a really long time. And you, of course, can selection bias any example of a bad outcome. And you can also selection bias at examples of nothing but good outcomes, right? And the truth is somewhere in between. So we have this global pandemic. And, you know, in the beginning, I took a step back and I say, okay, where is the reliable data? Okay, what's the mortality rate? Who's dying? Who's not having a hard time, and so forth? And it's not the Spanish flu, but it isn't the flu. It's somewhere in between. And for certain demographics, it's super, super tough. And then I could go no further than my brother. I call him up. He's an internist up in Wyoming. I say, how many COVID patients do you have? Oh, I have 12 patients. One's 25 on a ventilator and not doing so well. But is that the general trend? No. The vast majority of them, they're in 70s, and Gillette's in a bad area because it's a lot of coal miners. So their lungs are shot. So this is a real tough thing for them. And that's the demographic, right? That's the trend. So the media every day, they just broadcast fear porn and say we're all going to die and everything is not fact. And then it creates this anti-everything mentality. It's because it's just like if you lie to your kids and you say, hey kids, if you smoke marijuana, you're going to die. They smoke it, they don't die, you lose all credibility. Well, there are very good reasons to preach some conservatism there. We don't want you to be a loser stoner sitting on the couch who's 300 pounds overweight, eating pizza every day, playing Xbox. Okay. We want you to be a productive member of society. And if you're a habitual user of marijuana, smoking like 6 joints a day or, tons of edibles, you're probably not going to have any motivation to go out there and do things. So your parents are lying to you from a position of love in that case. The media, it's a position they want to make money. And because the lie stuck, it created an anti-everything mentality. Okay, so that is a prime example of where there's a failure in a social system and a diminishing trust in institutions.
But
So
how
the
can we
point-
fix this?
Exactly. This is the biggest challenge in the 21st century. Politicians being bad are just an example of what happens when you lose trust in institutions and society is not communicating well.
Mhm.
So we talk a lot in my industry, for example, about decentralized social networks. And I keep saying that's a red herring. It doesn't matter if you're Twitter or Mastodon, if you're Facebook or Minds, if you're, Instagram or Gab, that has nothing to do with the underlying problem. The problem is that people are getting radicalized, isolated, and siloed on these systems,
Mm.
and they're confirmation biasing their way into echo chambers that allow them to start believing lizard people are running the world and Bill Gates is trying to kill all of us with vaccines.
Mm.
Okay. So what you need to do is say, first, how do you de-radicalize people? Like, what does the cult deprogramming look like there?
Mm.
And that's the most fundamental thing. It doesn't matter if you're talking about a centralized or a decentralized platform. Then once they go into a platform, what are the communication patterns that will enable and reward deep, rich conversations, analysis, and critical thinking, as opposed to siloing and shallow conversations? Okay. How do you create incentives for that? So one of the magic superpowers of the cryptocurrency space is we're under the hood game theorists. We're cryptographers and distributed systems experts and programming language people. But at the end of the day, all this stuff only works when you have honest majority. Well, why do we have honest majorities? Because we pay them through mining and these other processes. So all day long, we think about how do we design incentives. The problem with social networks is the incentives are wrong. The algorithms are incentivized in a way to create maximal division because maximal division maximizes advertising profit. Just that simple. So you get what you pay for. So under the hood, outside of the de-radicalization, which is a super hard problem, and it's a psychological problem as much as a sociological problem, as much as a technological problem, you have to then say, in that decentralized network, how do you incentivize communication that is actual proper? And there's plenty of people who study this, like Alex Pentland, for example. He's out of MIT, and he wrote a lovely book called Social Physics, and he talks about idea flow. There's John Kleinberg over at Cornell, and he wrote papers on how people can basically strategically enter social networks and cause trollish havoc and disrupt things. And so there's people at Stanford who think about this, Cornell that think about this, and that's in the academic world. And there's certainly a lot of people in the business world who also talk about this, because the same things that promote idea flow in a social network will also promote idea flow in a corporation. You always ask, how do I make my employees more creative? How do I allow the bottom ideas to float up to the top, and we don't have groupthink, and we don't have the CEO mandating from heaven how everything needs to be? So the very same things that are in innovation management, the very same things in organizational creativity, the very same things that are communication patterns that avoid hostility and de-escalate and avoid people from becoming very bitter and having these radical cliques form, can actually be reapplied with the academic research to actually go into a social network. This is an example of a problem our industry is probably going to solve in 5 years to 10 years. And if we do, just like Facebook and Twitter and all these other social networks have had profound social impact and led to the rise of Trump, they can actually do the opposite. They'll have profound social impact and lead to the rise of a different class of leader who's held accountable to different standards. It's not about, I'm better than the other guy. It's, we have an agenda, we have goals. Did we achieve those goals or not? Tell me the KPIs. Where do we want to go? Imagine a business leader who said, well, I may have failed as a CEO, but I was a lot better than the other guy. It's either, me or that person. So you just have to leave me as CEO. No, your shareholders would throw you out. They'd say, are you making money? Are you growing the firm? Are you dealing with existential risk? Is it sustainable? What you're doing? Is the firm able to actually execute? Are we, in a good competitive position? All of those are OKRs or KPIs or whatever. Why the hell in 2021 doesn't the government work that way? When we say we want healthcare, you define what the fuck that means. You define what that has to have. And then what you do is you create KPIs around it, and then you hold your leader accountable. You said you promised 100 million people on this system by this date. If it didn't happen, let's get into the details and find out why. And you can't go blame the other guy and say, oh, it's so hard. Cry me a river. You're put in charge and you're given power for this very reason. So the reason we don't do that is our dialogue is not at that level, and people don't have those thinking skills quite yet. They haven't been let out of the Platonic cave quite yet. They're still chained in it. And somebody has to break those chains and kind of lead them outside. And the magic of our industry is that we compel people to think differently. Before Bitcoin existed, the common notion was you can't have private money. It's just not possible. Every time we've tried it, it's failed. People loot it. They steal all the money. They run away, from the Rothschilds to all the banks that failed in the 19th century. And then Bitcoin comes out, and then even central banks are saying, okay, we may have differences of opinion about monetary policy, but this thing is here to stay, and we're actually going to buy some of it, put it on our balance sheet, and treat it like a foreign currency. So just in 12 years, this mind virus has infected the world and convinced people that there's a third way for private money that's neither private nor government, and in many ways is close to the spirit of what we tried to achieve with the Federal Reserve System when we created it so long ago, over 100 years ago. Well, analogously, that mind virus can take over people for dialogue and for human interactions, and create new expectations about how we need to treat each other, how we need to develop a collective empathy, and how we hold each other accountable without the politics of personal destruction.
Absolutely. I think the core of it is really we have to teach. Also, we have to be teachers, right? We have to educate and give people really the opportunity to educate themselves. And the second part is, how do we get people out of their social bubble? And as you said, like the decentralized system can support this movement, that you are basically forced to look outside of your normal environment, what you're used to, and you're not fed all the time the same information that just confirms your biases already.
If the system's properly designed, or the system has to be the opposite, where it reinforces the bad behavior, and because it's decentralized, it's much harder to shut down and it's more resilient. You see,
but how much does a decentralized system in this regard correlates or similar to a modern democracy, or the democracy like the ancient Greeks envisaged?
There's no hiding, is there? There's no hiding, really. I mean, I won't go into the sort of details of that, but I think you've said it's safe, auditable investments. I think on the business side of things, I'm always looking at where does business see blockchain, and how does business see, and it has to be, is this information, is this data safe and reliable for me to be investing? And if I'm given all the opportunities, all those smart contracts are in place where we've agreed on the rules of the game, and they've all agreed to, and we can run these KPIs, and the SEC and FINRA are on board with what's happening with the policy, then it gives me confidence in developing business or into this and looking into sort of investments.
But doesn't it require that you agree on specific rules in the system? And there I see a potential problem. Like if different people come together and they have different rules, or they demand different rules to be applied, then it's still complicated, because then you mingle ideologies with rules.
Well, every system has a.
I can't lie about things that have happened. I'm growing oranges, I'm growing whatever, and that's put out there. It has to be something very specific and very, and I can link that to other things using AI and things.
But people may not like this, that they are governed by automated rules that you may find in a decentralized system. Huh? Of course, you can easily see now
but nobody
the
can lie.
benefits, like exactly like now you could say, okay, we voted, we have all the voting on the blockchain, and then no one can come up, no, but I won the election, so it's all fraud, right? It's all fake.
Well, yeah, let's talk into that. So blockchain's not magic.
Here we go.
It's just a public bulletin board. And so the point there is that you can put information, facts, into a system that is immutable, time-stamped, and auditable. So you say, okay, whatever it is, it can be a vote from an election, it can be who owns the property, whatever that might be, it's there. Now, what you do about that is a social consequence, ultimately. So all these systems do require a notion of dispute resolution. Now, for the most part, global commerce relies upon people getting along and agreeing and just following the rules. And 99.9997% of the time, we do, whether it be shipping or it be
Right.
banking relationships or wire transfers. The vast majority of time, people will just follow the programming. And then what happens is when you have a dispute, that ends up consuming, like a Pareto principle, the majority of your time and resources, because those usually are around edge cases that the system has not really a good solution for. You know, for example, let's say you're talking about estates and there's no will, and then grandpa dies and you're like, which one of the grandkids gets what and so forth. It's like, okay, well, we got to figure this out. And there's 1,000 of these types of things that flow every day. And the legacy legal systems, for the most part, they've evolved. They've kind of co-evolved with markets to address these commercial demands. The problem is they evolved in silos. So there's the Chinese way of doing things and the Russian way of doing things, the American way of doing things. And when you globalize, suddenly you have to have a dominant standard. And usually you do that historically through empires, Pax Romana. You know, you just conquer everything. You say, well, we're going to go with the Roman way because if we don't, they'll kill us. It's like, oh, okay. And, you know, we had the British Empire, then we had the American Empire. Now the 21st century, it's a Thucydides trap. Are we going to be on the American or the Chinese way? But that's not productive because it's disenfranchising to the other 7 billion people who would rather live in a more democratic way. The problem is you need a different way of sorting these things out. So you need a global dispute resolution system, and you need a global way of representing value. And in many cases, you can automate that. Now, I would hazard that most people at this point are okay with some degree of automation resolving disputes. And there's numerous examples in commercial activity, especially for low value transactions, where automation is okay, you know, and we're even seeing this now with the curation of information, where algorithms more often than not are responsible for 99% of the deplatforming on YouTube, not a human being intervening, right? And we can argue, is this a good idea or a bad idea? But algorithmic governance is coming and it's happening. And as AI gets more sophisticated and we merge it with a little bit of human judgment, that combination of the two, I think will be quite effective, because you can get breadth where you can go, you know, across the entire space, but then you also have depth where it's needed in these types of things. There's also a lot of very difficult national questions, like the ownership of genetic material, for example. We'd like to believe we own our own genes. Actually, I think your background's in genetics. I mean, this is probably stuff you were studying.
This is the whole concept of my company. We say you as the private individual, you own your data, you own the code, and you can do whatever you want to do with it, and nobody else owns it.
It gets a little complicated, though. So let's say that you catch COVID and it mutates, and then suddenly you have a new strain. You know, who owns that strain of COVID when they're doing genetic surveillance? You know, maybe the vaccine companies would like to have that. Is that your property because it was created from you technically in your body as the host? Is it not your property? And then I remember years ago, I was studying bacteriophages, and they're great alternative potential treatment for antibiotics. But one of the reasons they never really took off was it was very difficult to monetize them. So, you know, we said, you know, it's a complementary treatment. You can give phages to people and you can give antibiotics to people at the same time, especially for topical applications like burns, great treatment protocol. But it's like, well, who owns all the genes? How do we patent this? How do we monetize this? So there's all these IP questions that exist. And then those IP questions, people travel, you leave genetic material behind. So even if you own it in the US, what if you don't own it in China? these types of things. And it's becoming a very big issue, and it's going to only become a larger and larger issue, especially that we have these super powerful tools to do things. So that's the point of blockchain, is it says, well, maybe we don't need a government. Maybe we can create private standards that are transnational. And as long as the governments endow them with delegative authority and say, like a treaty, we agree to follow this interpretation, we're okay. And we have a dispute resolution mechanism, and there's a way to buy and trade these instruments of value. There's a chain of custody that shows you who's owned them throughout, and you kind of get an alternative system. The advantage of this is that you can do bespoke regulation right into the transaction itself. And you can do it almost like software. So let's say you're dealing with 6 countries, like the United States is in it, and there's China, and then 4 African countries. Who the hell's laws do you follow? It's like, wow, this is a really complicated thing. Well, what you can do is you can take the transaction and you can add on top smart contracts that are connected to the regulations of each country and say, okay, as that transaction, the value it's carrying is flowing from person to person, the regulations that will be in account is where that person is domiciled. So if they're in Senegal, that's the regulation we're following for this moment. But then the minute it hits Uganda, that's the regulation we're following. Then it goes to the country of Georgia. That's the regulation we're following. Then the UK, then America, then China. And it's all just automated. So it's built right in. The taxes are there. The regulations are there. The information disclosures are there. And it just changes as you go through. No lawyers involved. It's totally automated. This is the kind of system that we're converging to when we talk about blockchain being basically the trust engine of the commons, and a new way of doing transnational regulation.
This is exactly what we want to build, and maybe you can help with the Cardano blockchain to help us achieving this at some point. But it still needs basically a consensus. You have to still work within a framework. Like you cannot just work on a global level and completely ignoring governments. Like they
but
will
the governments
step
will act
onto
as agents of it. What they do is they enforce the policy. We see this a lot in maritime law, where there's, you have to ship things. There's 100+ countries that are regularly doing that. So the local jurisdictions have agreed through treaty to enforce international standards and conventions. So even though these are transnational, they'll be localized when there's a dispute, and that localization will be understandable. So basically you just say, okay, once we've come to these private understandings, contract law applies, and courts will actually enforce the will of the blockchain because they have all the evidence there. It's non-reputable, it's irreversible, it's auditable. You have an ordering, so you know the timestamps of when things have happened and so forth. So it's much easier to get to the heart of the matter. And then when we talk about contracts, what it's going to do is result in the standardization of contracts in a machine understandable way. The problem with contract law at the moment is very ambiguous, and by design, and lawyers kind of make their money on the ambiguous edges, right? And so when you actually talk about legal debugging, like how do you know your contract doesn't have bugs in it? Tax law certainly has a lot. How do you know your contract is especially larger ones, is not contradictory? How do you know it's actually in the best interest of all the parties? Well, if you can mechanize a human contract into a machine understandable contract, and then you get the parties to agree to that interpretation of it, then the courts will agree to that interpretation of it. And then there's no ambiguity that remains. And it makes dispute resolution significantly easier in that respect, regardless of the legal system that you happen to be encumbered with, because they've pre-agreed to follow this. And most countries will allow you to do that. But it's a bear of a problem, but it's something we're going to be tackling for over 100 years, I think. This is the challenge of this century. But the alternative is Pax Romana. It's just let somebody have an empire, define all the rules for the entire world, and live under that rule set until a more powerful empire comes and destroys the declining one, either through treaty or through war, and then let them run the world for 100 years. And I'd like to believe we as humans have evolved to a point where that model is necessary.
Absolutely. I mean, look at it. I mean, this is all the things you just explained. It just tells us, look, there's so many opportunities. It's actually a very exciting time, and we have to be a little bit positive about it, not always see the negatives. And so in this context, like, facts are beautiful. And I saw you ranting on another video on YouTube, I think, where you said, like, if you disagree with facts, you are an idiot. Yeah. So, and I love that, because facts are really important for our lives, and for the people out there, for our listeners. Like, I can really recommend a book from a guy called Hans Rosling, who's unfortunately not with us anymore. A book called Factfulness. This is a very good book about how we misjudge things in the world, and that we, as a human species, we cannot really see several facts properly. We are biased. We're so biased that we are worse than chimpanzees when they randomly pick solutions in the questionnaire. And this is quite fascinating. And we have to find ways to deal with facts, to accept facts. We know the Earth is not flat. I believe that. So I know there are people that would disagree. But we have the scientific methods to work on
earlier
this.
that 98% or the majority of the world population believed at one point that the world was flat, but there was one person that said no, and so one person could make a big difference about facts. And
right, and there's also a verification cost, and there's this real wonderful concept that I didn't know until I entered the cryptocurrency space, and now it just makes the world. It's one of those things that really helps me create understanding about why the world is the way it is. It's called rational ignorance. And so rational ignorance is one of those things where the cost of knowing something is higher than the value of knowing it. and you can create like a weaker version of rational ignorance where you may believe something, but verifying that just simply takes too much time. 99.9% of the world believes that the world is round, it's spherical, okay, it's a ball. But to verify that, you actually can conduct experiments yourself. They take a little bit of time. There's great guides on YouTube and on the web. And if you actually ask people, non-physics majors, how many of you took the time to go and do this exercise? Probably very few people have. So the danger, though, is that there's this appeal to authority. And so while true things may be common notions, unfortunately, false things can end up being common notions as well.
That's
like
right,
this, you only use 10% of your brain. It's actually not true, but just people believe it because they've heard people that they consider to be credible say those kinds of things, and it kind of sticks. So, there's a hierarchy of knowledge of what do you believe to be true, what do you believe to be true, and you've verified yourself, and what level of verification have you struggled with to get there. And that's why the academic world is so powerful in certain respects. It's a crucible where the scientific method forces you to dehumanize things and look at things in a very dispassionate way, and then expose it to a kind of a collective consciousness and see if it survives that rigor and scrutiny. We'd like to believe that is always the case, but we see there's certain fields of academia that have succumbed to more subjectivity and no reproducibility and so forth. We even see it in the sciences. Like I study mathematics, and you'd like to believe mathematicians are like the most rigorous of all of the field. And the reality is it's not. We just had Kevin Buzzard, who's a professor at Imperial, come to my company and give a lecture on computerization of mathematical proofs. So basically, you're using special purpose programming languages like Lean and Coq and Agda to be able to actually take a pen and paper mathematical proof and turn it into something a machine can check. You'd like to think that mathematicians will, oh yeah, that's great. 99% of mathematicians either don't want to or don't know how to do those things. And computer scientists aren't as rigorous, and so they tend not to care about that stuff either outside of program verification to know that their software is behaving correctly. So you have these amazing tools to actually verify if your mathematical proofs are right or wrong, and mathematicians, the most rigorous of the people, don't tend to use them. So Kevin mentioned a story about Peter Solzhenitsyn, and he's a very famous mathematician who's in algebraic number theory and does all this incredible work. And Peter recently won the Fields Medal. And so he has this one theorem he came up with, and he said, can you mechanize it for me? And Kevin's like, well, why? And he said, well, here's my problem. I'm too prestigious. No one checks my work anymore. I'm a Fields medalist. I publish a paper, and they normally hold workshops and they talk about it. But because my reputation is too strong, no one is reading the proofs anymore. They're just assuming that they're right. So it's an appeal to authority in a field that by definition should be professionally skeptical. So we're allowing personal biases to influence that. So that's the point of having good tools. They keep you honest. Even in the rigorous fields, you can succumb to a lack of honesty in that respect.
Absolutely.
And in
I mean,
blockchain does that in social systems. It's so tempting when the numbers get big, when commerce behaves a certain way, to cheat. A great example would have been Mt. Gox with Bitcoin. So that was an exchange that collapsed back in 2013. The core developers of Bitcoin had to make a really hard decision. They personally had millions of dollars of Bitcoin on Mt. Gox. So they had to decide, do we compromise the integrity of the protocol and reverse the transaction to reimburse ourselves with money that we know, or do we allow the money to be stolen and just disappear into the ether, losing millions of dollars of our own money? So what matters more, the integrity of the system, the protocol, or our personal wealth? Well, guess what? They decided to be Cincinnatus and say, hey, we're actually going to let the protocol be as it is. And they didn't reverse the transactions and reimburse themselves and take the money away from the people. So it created a mentality and a culture within the Bitcoin community of code is law, and these transactions are irreversible, and the protocol is going to behave the way it behaves, regardless if it's inconvenient to you or not. And every single person who uses the system has that social contract and has to accept that very uncomfortable mirror that sometimes shows you things that you don't want to see, and sometimes has not the best consequences to you personally, but overall it's a fair system. So what's so exciting is we get to build systems like that in the sciences, in money, in voting, in identity management. And what's great is they're truly egalitarian. They truly respect each individual as they are and treat everybody fairly. Doesn't mean you're going to have great outcomes. Some people don't. And we've seen that in our industry, but it does mean that at least you have fair outcomes, which is entirely new in the human race. We're not fair.
Absolutely. I think we had a very exciting time point for our human species. And to wrap it up here, I think, Charles, you have to jump off. Maybe to give us some insights, or for young scientists, or for young people who want to go into science. Where do you see good opportunities in the coming years? What are fields? Like if you would be 10, 15 years younger and you would have to start again, what would you do? Where would you go?
Well, I think probably the most useful major you can have is computer science, because it intersects everything at this point, and you can apply those skills to any practical field, whether it be engineering or the social sciences. And basically it's an extension of how do you think. That, taking majors away or study away, being able to just sit down and reason about a problem, whatever that problem is, and look at it from different perspectives and angles, is the single most valuable skill set that you can cultivate as a person. And being able to think in a slow, systematic way is actually the fastest way. It's an old Zen koan, the slow way is the fast way. And there's so much truth to that. 5 extra minutes or 10 extra minutes of really contemplating can prevent so much heartache, tragedy, and sadness in your career. And there are plenty of thinking tools. There's great authors like Dan Dennett who write about mind tools. You can practice mindfulness meditation, and that gives you so much clarity, insight, and patience in what you do. But just developing the ability to deal with computing as an extension of your ability to think, to learn data science and be able to understand how to make data-driven decisions, to understand your personal cognitive biases and human cognitive biases in general, and create systems to allow you to deal with those cognitive biases and broaden problems. And then the other thing is to learn collective empathy. It's not just what's good for you, living a very self-centered life, but then ask yourself, why do people feel the way they feel? And why do they have this perspective? One of the most valuable things I had to learn was that people, when they disagree, they're usually not disagreeing about facts. They're disagreeing about values. They come with different values to the table, and even though you're talking about the same thing, you're actually talking about different things. So you're actually probably both right from your perspectives, and actually having the ability to broaden yourself to think about the other person's values and their point of view and do it in a very dispassionate way is so incredibly powerful. And it's something I didn't really cultivate in my early 20s. And I wish I had, because I would have avoided so much pain in life, you know, to have that superpower. And we as a society don't emphasize that at all. And, you know, the final thing is that we tend to be over scientific in a certain respect. You need to have equal parts appreciation for arts and for culture and music, you know, and that was one of my biggest regrets. If I could go back and do it all again, I would have taken watercolor classes and drawing courses. And I used to play the piano. I would have kept that up and so forth. I would have done all of that. Why? Because that tells you just as much about the human condition in life as the sciences do. But because they don't have a direct economic impact, people tend to undervalue them and say, well, yeah, that's how you get poor. When you study philosophy and think about life and the meaning of life and read Ernest Becker and these types of things, somehow that's useless knowledge, whereas building stuff, that's useful knowledge. But you say, well, if you want to be a great engineer, you have to be an inspired engineer. If you want to be a great entrepreneur, you have to be an inspired entrepreneur, which means that you have to have some connection to humanity, and that's distinctly different than the old stale connections of the companies that came before you. So if you want to truly excel in life, you have to be a very balanced person and, you know, have all these different skill sets. And my biggest grievance with universities is they don't teach this in any sense of the word. They don't teach you how to do note taking. They don't teach you how to think. They don't teach you how to critically think. They don't teach you how to debate. They just create silos. And in many cases, they actually create very bad cultures with the latest crop of students that come out. So be a little contrarian, go off the beaten path, follow Robert Frost's advice, and mix it up. You know, and if I do it all over again on computer science and arts, and I'd gone down that way, and I probably would have ended up in the same place, but a lot less white hair and probably in better shape.
Well, thank you so much. This was seriously great advice. So I wish I had that advice when I was 30 years younger. But look, thank you so much. This was wonderful having you here, and this was really so far. I think it's a great podcast, and I would love to have you on again at some point in the future. Thank you so much, and yeah, good luck with all of your projects. You must be super busy. So if people want to find out about your work, about Cardano, I think they can Google it or use
Cardano.org or go to IOHK.io, and both sites have ample information. And obviously I have a Twitter feed, and we have a YouTube channel and these type of things. So, you know, just go to them and subscribe and so forth.
Perfect. We will
you're
also
a Google search away from finding this.
We will also add the links here in the channel, and so everyone can find out about what you are doing and maybe join the movement. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Charles.
Let's wrap it up. Thanks, everyone. That was fantastic. Have a great rest of the week, and let's make the best out of this year. Yeah. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you, Daryl.
Okay, so the editing is done. That was a really good show, huh? Yeah. Oh, you are still here. Look, the show is over. You could go home and do something useful now. But since you are still here, please subscribe to the show. Oh, and there's something else you could do. Wait a second. I'll show you. Oh, yeah. Listen to this. If you have the time, please subscribe to the show. And what you could also do is leave a like below. And after that, don't forget, if you are on YouTube, please press the bell icon so you get all the news. Okay, I think I don't do that anymore.